Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Hey, today I would like to actually get into an issue, well, I don't know whether you would call it psychology, whether you would call it occult. It will touch on certain conspiracy theories and how those relate to those two previous subjects. And I'm going to kind of leave it open-ended as to how people really interpret this. But anyway, before I begin, I'd like to encourage people, if you are listening to this later on YouTube, then please subscribe to this channel and keep informed of upcoming shows that you might not be available to listen to. And also check out my new science fiction novel, The Destiny of Our Past. And you can find that on a lot of different venues, but I guess the main one would be Amazon that you can check, The Destiny of Our Past. And I'm going to talk about that book a little bit here because it relates to this whole topic of archetypes. And it doesn't answer the question, though, where the archetypes come from originally. But if you had psychology back in college, you probably ran into that term, archetypes, when you were studying Carl Jung. And as you recall, Carl Jung was a student / colleague of Sigmund Freud. He eventually broke with Freud because he felt that Freud dealt a little bit too much with sex being the primary motivation for human behavior. He also felt that the human consciousness, or I should say subconsciousness, was much deeper than Freud had originally speculated, and that humans have what you could call a collective unconsciousness that entails a memory of, well, human history, something that goes way, way, way far back. And the closer you're related to someone, the more you would share that. So, in a sense, the way you see the world and the way the world is interpreted back to you is through archetypes. Now, people in film use archetypes quite a bit, and I guess essentially how you could describe them is something that has meaning, something that carries the meaning throughout the human spectrum of time. It can also refer to collective memory. Okay, that's associated with it. The idea that something that could have happened in the past that affected our ancestors in a somewhat traumatic way could still be communicated through to us if we got deep enough into the collective unconsciousness. And that perhaps these kinds of symbols will show us things, but it also will communicate to us the way that we want to make the world as well as to see the world. Now, I remember I was reading. Before I get into the main thrust, and that being the weird coincidences I ran into, because I didn't study the more occult aspects of this sort of thing until after I had actually finished the rough draft of my sci-fi book. And then some people read it. I just wanted them to review it and see what they thought, and they were like, "Whoa, how did you know this kind of stuff? I know you're not into like ancient Sumerian history. You're not into gaming. Sometimes gamers will use these kinds of things in their storylines for their particular creations. And I was just like, well, I don't know. But they'd say, well, you got it right. So I started studying this stuff. And what really inspired me to do this show here is not so much that, but the other day I was actually reading through a very interesting article. I love American history. I love American history. World history as well. But I ran across something, of all places, in the Library of Congress. You know, a publication there. And you can look this up if you don't believe me, okay, as I describe it. Thomas Jefferson wanted to make Washington, D.C., he wanted to employ a lot of ancient symbolism in his design. And one thing he wanted to do, for instance, was he wanted a spire, and I'll tell you what that spire represents here in just a second, okay? And you can look all of this stuff up, please do so. But Jefferson wanted the dome, of the Capitol. He wanted the dome to be dedicated to the ancient gods, pagan gods. Okay? So in a sense, first of all, the dome has symbolic value as well, in that, for instance, the Egyptian tradition, it refers to the idea of Ishtar. And if you take Ishtar back far enough, it goes all the way back to Sumeria. You know how the Roman gods, when you were studying these things, like in school, in high school or whatever, at least when I went to school, they studied this kind of stuff. I don't know what they study now, but you always confuse the Roman gods and the Greek gods, and then you found out that essentially the Romans just made the Greek gods into Roman versions. And for the most part, there may be some differences, but essentially that's what they did. And if you take a look at the Norse gods, and you're going, well, wait a minute, it seems they have the same dynamism, then you see that there is this kind of interlocking sort of play with the gods. Now, Jung would raise his hand and go, yeah, you see, that shows the archetypes. We have to communicate the symbols through these gods, through this mythology. Although sometimes you could say maybe it's not necessarily mythology, and that's what I bring up in my book. But the dome, the symbol of the dome itself, and often you'll see in domes at the very top the sunlight can come through and so forth. Well, it's supposed to represent the eternal womb, okay, of Ishtar. So in a sense, it's kind of a fertility symbol. Now you got to remember, if you watch, films from the 1950s, for instance, especially those ones that came out of Italy with the bad dubbing on them, you think that, well, fertility symbols and fertility cults and so forth was just sex cults, and in some ways, I guess they could be considered such. But most of the time, fertility symbols actually referred to the idea of procreation. Okay, it did not have a lewd or licentious sort of connotation that often modern day people place on the ancients. All right, now yes, there were some weird groups, and I guess you could say cults, although cult is actually just means culture. It's the same word. That did some pretty heinous sacrifices and so forth, but for the most part, fertility symbols and so forth were to revere birth and renewal of life and so forth, and like a lot of that was associated with the Nile for the Egyptians. The idea that the waters, when they flooded, would bring nutrients and fertilize the soils, and then the crops could be planted and grow for the next season. So there was a great deal of emphasis in their religion on the Nile, although their religion dates back to ancient Mesopotamia and Babylonia, and probably goes all the way back to Noah. Okay, So, anyway, that's not all. As you know, that's not all. He wanted the spire, the obelisk, as well. Now, in occult symbolism, and that was very popular in the late 1700s and even the 1800s, and you can look this up. I mean, first of all, most people don't realize that Jefferson wanted, the dome is not to be like, okay, we're going to dedicate this to the Christian God. It was to dedicate it to the pagan gods. Now, the founding fathers, for the most part, were Christian, but many of them also dabbled into a lot of esoteric stuff. Okay, most of them were Masonic. Many of them dealt with, went into things that were a little deeper. And, anyone with incredible intelligence in those days would probably be expected to have done so. Okay, this was not some sort of dark, satanic type of thing. This was just trying to look into history and figure out all of these parallels and maybe even some of the energies. I think Jefferson was kind of into that idea of the energy coming down and affecting the course of human events, so to speak. And the obelisk itself, which later an obelisk was built, a memorial to George Washington. It's the largest obelisk in the world. But ultimately, if you go back into Egyptian symbolism, the obelisk refers to the story of Set. When these are gods, okay? These are supposed to be gods. They have their parallels to gods in Samaria as well, but we're not going to make this a big, long lesson about comparative religion. The thing is that Set kills Osiris. Now, this kind of ticks off Isis. Okay, she goes and finds the body, and later Set wants, because you can bring the body back to life. You're a god, okay? But then Set decides he's going to mutilate the body. He's going to cut it up and spread it all over the place. And then Isis goes out and finds the body parts and then puts them all together, but she's missing something. Well, guess what part's missing? Yeah, that's right, the phallus. That's a polite way of saying the penis. Anyway, the phallus is missing. So you have to build. She had to make a fake one. Okay, and that's where the tradition dates back to the obelisk. And so if you think about it, again, this is a fertility symbol. It goes way back to the ancient Egyptians. It's hard to say exactly how much modern people understand about this kind of stuff. And that's where we get into conspiracies and that sort of thing. For instance, I read an article the other day, which was quite interesting. Remember, I started researching this stuff because I just thought it was fascinating after I had written my book. I'm going to get into that in a moment. The thing is that, I've been to Vatican City many times. And if you notice, when you go to Vatican City, you've got the dome, okay, and you've got this big freaking obelisk out front. Now, I'm not going to get into the Star of Inanna, which there's different names for it, but the 8-pointed star, that if you look at Vatican City from the air, you see the 8 points going out from the obelisk. And also, I think the symbol of Rome is the Star of Inanna. Now, again, it's got another name that people give it, but go back and check it. It's the Star of Inanna. And so, really, in a sense, if you had Carl Jung here, he would probably say Vatican City, in a sense, is a giant fertility symbol. because you got the dome, and then you've got the obelisk right there. Now, I don't know if whatever pope built this, had the obelisk after they, the Romans stole it from the Egyptians. I don't know how much he knew about this. It's really hard to say. I do know that I read that when the obelisk was being brought into Rome to be put up in Vatican City, that he issued a death penalty for anyone who even spoke. Now, I don't know whether that was for reverence of the obelisk as it was being moved, or, it's a huge obelisk too, or if it was for the safety, like if the horses were spooked or something like this, if people talked, then maybe they would drop the obelisk and it would break. I don't know, but it was a death penalty if people spoke. And then you were required to applaud once it was erected. I do believe it's not stuck in the ground. It is freestanding. It's the gravity, actually. There's another one like this in St. Peter's. Not St. Peter's, but right in front of the, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. There's one of those. And they have obelisk also in London and so forth. So, in a sense, in Western society, the obelisk seems to be in a lot of our really important cities. And again, you go into this like, well, is this coincidence or whatever? I don't know. But Jung would say it may not be something where there's some people in a back room saying, well, let's have these symbols and bring down this energy from the universe. Instead, it could be a collective unconsciousness that recognizes the allure of this kind of symbolism, and therefore it gets repeated in human society. Now you may ask, well, why don't they have the same sort of symbols in other societies? There are similarities, but the development of the arch may have actually given it more prominence within the Near East and Europe. So you're more likely to get the domes and so forth. You do have in Native American culture, you do have in many places the totem pole, which is, of course, a long spire. And Freud, of course, talked about the symbol of the totem, the idea of the incest taboo and that sort of thing, but I'm not going to get into that so much. So there was this recognition that these poles really do have a symbolic value. Now, just kind of connecting this to the whole thing with Vatican City, when I was writing my book, I came up with this idea of how the plot was going to be. I wrote an outline, and then I free write it. When I do my writing, I don't actually go back and forth with some sort, what would you call it, some sort of outline. All right, I instead do the outline and everything, but then I usually just throw it away in my mind. I just start the book, and it took directions that I had no idea. Now, the one thing I did borrow from Sumerian text were just names. I just got a whole bunch of names that were from ancient Sumeria, gods and so forth. Also the just names, and I used those for the characters. With the idea that ultimately the gods of ancient Sumeria were based on real human beings who lived prior to the flood. And of course they you had a break where Noah was someone who was, of course, he's not even really in the book as a character, just as someone doing something that people are talking about. Yeah, you ever wonder that? What was going on in those days? Was Noah just kind of doing, you always hear about Noah, but you don't hear about what the other people were up to, what they were doing. How did they react to this guy who was building this boat? And why was it so symbolic that he was building this wooden ship? Okay, well, the symbolism could be that the society was way more advanced than that. And the idea of someone building a wooden ship would be similar. Here's a parallel. Here comes a parallel. Could be similar to when Isaiah was commanded, inspired by God, whatever, to do missionary work in Israel naked. Now, he was trying to symbolize, note, symbolism, archetypes, naked, nude. He was probably from the upper class. Being naked was no big deal in Bible days. I mean, if you did heavy, hard work like fishing, for instance, the apostles, for instance, in the New Testament, would have fished nude. Okay, I mean, it's not exactly, you don't have all that many clothes, and if you're handling fish, you don't want to smell like a fish all day and all night. Okay, so you would fish naked. And that was something that laborers did. Okay, that's why when King David was celebrating this great victory over the Philistines, and one of his wives, gets angry at him because when he's dancing, you could see his reproductive organs were exposed when he was dancing, and she was like, "Oh, you're acting like a commoner." And then we read later that she was no longer able to have children. So the implication was that you don't jump on someone who's anointed of God for celebrating a victory that was delivered to him by God, even if he is dancing semi-nude. But the symbolism of Isaiah being naked was the idea that it represented how they would be if they were taken prisoner. Because when you took prisoners in those days, you didn't want them sneaking weapons, so you would strip them naked and lead them off, either to just get them away from the war situation, or usually just to sell them as, castrate them and sell them as slaves or whatever. And so the Bible's full of symbolism, and sometimes detractors take away, it's all symbolism. No, it's not, but often symbolism is used. Now, back to Rome. Okay, all roads lead back to Rome. So we go to Rome. One of the things I've seen on popes' outfits, and I'll go back to my book. One of the things I've seen on popes' outfits is the Maltese cross. You know what cross that is. It's the one where if you're young enough, if you're old enough, I should say, and you went trick-or-treating, and there was this special cross, kind of the one that it looks like the ones you see on old World War I German airplanes. If you see those on a movie or just in a museum, that special cross. And you see that also on many of the Pope's outfits. Now, the interesting thing is, you can go back to the god Ninurta of the Sumerian pantheon of gods, and you will also see that on his breastplate is the Maltese cross. This cross predates Jesus by, if you go by that, it's 2,000 years, and yet it is a symbol that has been adopted into Christianity. Now, why is that? Is it because the Catholics were just trying to say, well, we need something that looks cool? Or was it that it was some sort of archetype, as Jung would say? Now, here's the creepy part. I mentioned that my main character in the book, he's supposed to be a doctor who gives up being a doctor because at one point he's asked by a parent, by two parents, if they would euthanize their 5-year-old daughter because she's just not up to par intellectually with other kids. And so this society is a very eugenic-based society. And he can't do it. He can't bring himself to do that, so he becomes a private investigator. But the interesting thing is that I wrote that he was from the Nerta bloodline, and that that his ancestors were either doctors or religious leaders. And I had no clue. I seriously had not even seen that cross, on the Sumerian depictions. Now, that could just be coincidence. But then the character that's supposed to be representative of Inanna, who in the book, yes, she goes, her name is switched to Inanna in the book, and there's some symbolism in there. In the Bible, they used to switch names all the time to promote a viewpoint. And the thing is that I describe her in ways that fit the actual, oh my gosh, even to the point that at some point she's going to be resurrected. She will be resurrected. You'd have to read the book to understand what that resurrection would refer to. And then I find out that in the Sumerian religion, she is resurrected. And then she brings life around her. Some of the bad guys in it, like Enlil, although he's not totally presented as a bad guy, just a corporate leader who's trying to wrestle control from his brother Enki. And I find that I've described everything according to the way it actually is described in their religion. And there's other names that are just, freaky. Again, I did not read these things. I was never a scholar. I mean, that kind of history just did not interest me. So I never looked at it. Now, there are several ways to look at it. I have talked to some people who say that maybe it was being influenced by the occult. Maybe it was a bad spirit trying to get the information out, kind of a Luciferian type thing. Now, I'm not a Luciferian, okay? I don't necessarily find that that's a way I want to describe my writing. I did not, invoke any weird stuff. But the parallels, there's a lot of parallels. I mean, almost every page has a parallel to the actual god, interaction between these gods. Even though the main character is not, he's not supposed to be one of these people. Okay, the main character, Mishara, he's the person you see this society through 3 months before the destruction of the flood. Other characters, there is one very important character who is supposed to be the granddaughter, one of Noah's granddaughters, but she has turned away. Her mother has turned away from Noah, and that has polluted her mind towards her grandfather. But most of the other people that are important in the society, the people that are in charge, they are the only thing I did was I took the names of the gods, but I didn't know who or how they interacted, and then I find out this is the way they did. And the one explanation one can think of is this connection to the collective unconsciousness. Now, in that sense, it could be, and I've heard several speakers since then describe this, that when the flood occurred, it destroyed most of humanity. It wiped out the major civilization, which would have been made up of a variety of cities. If you go back to the Atlantean narrative, which I do touch on, it wasn't just Atlantis. There were several other major cities, and that vied for power. In some traditions, may have had wars that involved nuclear weapons, but they would have been totally and utterly destroyed. And I placed the center of these civilizations in Antarctica, with a very detailed explanation as to why, with the climate shifting and why the climate did shift, which would explain, for instance, why you find mammoths quick frozen in parts of Siberia with full stomachs of lush vegetation, but quick frozen. Like, one minute they were alive and just doing their thing, the next minute they were frozen stiff. This would suggest that there was a major upheaval about 12,000 years ago. And the idea would then be that whether you're a descendant of Noah or not, okay, I really don't see any I don't see any firm evidence, even in the Bible, that only 8 people survived. We see the perspective of Noah that 8 people survived, but he was only looking at the civilization as he saw it. It would be like when Jesus said the thing about the mustard seed, the smallest seed is the mustard seed. Well, obviously there are seeds that are smaller than mustard seeds. But Jesus would have probably been aware of that, but he was talking to the people of his day. All right, Noah wouldn't be expected to be sitting there going, okay, well, my family survived. There was 8 people. There's probably way more than that on the boat. Way more. The Islamic tradition puts it at about 100. But why would he speak about the people everywhere else? I mean, is there any mention of Australian Aborigines in the Bible? No. Well, does that mean they don't exist? I mean, obviously, the whole world did not have to be wiped out. If your civilization is wiped out, okay, if everything you knew was wiped out through a series of upheavals and climatic shocks and tsunamis that would have probably been enough to make sure that there was nothing left of major cities on the coastlines of this society, then there'd be no evidence. And what evidence you could have survived for 12,000 years would be buried under, hundreds of meters of sedimentary rock under the ocean. Not in mountains, but under the ocean. But the peoples that would have survived in the mountain areas, they would have seen the devastation. They would have experienced devastation that would not necessarily have been floods, but they would have experienced trauma beyond belief. But they still would have survived. And this would be whether you were from Noah's line or whether you were from some of these lines, you would still carry this in the collective unconsciousness. And, there have been people that have tried to tap into that research as well as tap into the collective unconsciousness, like Helena Blavatsky was one, many, many others. But it all gets back to an age that was very advanced in our history that was destroyed. And perhaps we still have that buried within us. Maybe our inspiration for science fiction films today, maybe our desire to rediscover what we used to know is propelling us today. I mean, take a look at books like the Book of Jasher or the Book of Enoch. They read like a science fiction novel, but yet they were written thousands of years ago. Whether they are forgeries or not, the forgeries would have been thousands of years ago. And, when you have stuff talking about, like the Book of Jasher, talking about the reason for the flood was because people were messing around with genetics and crossing animals and humans and so forth to provoke God. Not magic. It was just that they were told that they learned how to do it. And look at what we're doing now. I mean, I take a look at you take a look at some of the articles out now. I was reading yesterday an article that was talking about how wonderful it was going to be that in 10 years we're going to be superhumans. We're 10 or 15 years. We're going to be superhumans because you're going to be able to put microchips in the brain that can erase bad memories and put in different memories instead. Isn't that wonderful? And that's a book I just finished. I don't even have a name for it. It's being edited right now. But it deals with this particular subject. Because if you can put memories in and you can erase bad memories, why couldn't you totally erase who someone is and replace them with someone that you design? In other words, you take in someone who's just like, I don't know, Frank Smith, a normal 40-year-old guy. He's had maybe he's gone through a divorce here or there, a couple kids, just, regular old American guy. And he's got some depression and anxiety and all this kind of stuff. So he goes into the doctor, and the doctor says, well, let's just fix you up. We'll give you this implant, and tell us about your really, really bad memories, and we'll try to make things to where you'll be a much happier person. And Frank's going, yeah, fine. But what if the doctor goes ahead and erases everything? What if he totally erases everything and puts in a series of memories that have been designed by some sort of person who's an expert at computers and creates a new Frank? Maybe the Frank has the memories of who his friends and relatives are and what his job is, but he's a totally different individual. You think about, well, gee, I mean, that's new. But yet we read in the New Testament where Jesus says he returns when we're back to when the world was when it was in Noah's day. Interesting. Return when it's like Noah's day. What would be unique to our era that's never been seen for thousands of years that would be a return to Noah's era? What about biotechnology? The closest we can get to biotechnology up till recent years is either selective breeding. Okay, that's why we got all of our varieties of cats and dogs and so forth, and cattle. But that's about it. That's it. You could graft a cherry branch onto an apple tree and grow cherries. But ultimately, that's still an apple tree. You've just made it done a parasite type thing and put the cherry tree on instead. But you still need that apple tree. But we're now in an era where we can cross apples and cherries. We're now in an era where you read about tiny parts of human brains taken out and put into mice. Okay? Images of that old cartoon Pinky and the Brain. But yeah, they're doing that. We got goats that they take spider DNA and put into them so that they'll produce silk. You dry the milk and it's silk. And there's other stories that talk about we only take it to embryo stage, crossing human and rabbit, for instance. And in all likelihood, if you took an embryo that's a cross between a human and rabbit to term, it would die. Okay? It would be like that scene in one of the Aliens movies where Wrigley looks at all these attempts to make a human alien hybrid, and all of these attempts have just failed. I think there's like one of them that's mostly human but still pretty messed up, and she's begging her to kill her in it. But we don't quite, I don't think we have the technology yet that you could line the DNA up in such a way that you would create and complete, like you could get something from Narnia. something that's like a half human, half rabbit. But I don't see it. It's impossible. If DNA is merely a blueprint, it'd be like taking blueprints from one house and blueprints from a totally different house and finding out how you could merge them to make a house that would look like both. It would have elements of both. And I read another article the other day talking about NASA thinking about using drugs to. They thought the idea has been brought up. I don't know if they're really into doing it, but the idea has been speculated about that you could change the DNA of already existing astronauts so that they would be able to survive space and colonization of Mars. Okay? And other articles I've seen that have said that maybe we could create, embryos that would still be human, but they would have elements of animal DNA that would help them survive the low oxygen of Mars. Now, I don't know if they could come back to Earth. I don't think they would be able to, because maybe there'd be too much oxygen. They'd pass out. But you could create humans that could still be totally like you and me, but they don't need as much oxygen. But you'd have to mix them, mix them with a walrus DNA. It doesn't mean they're going to look like walrus and human, not necessarily. But you could make it to where they have that kind of ability to hold their breath or utilize their oxygen in that way. And, oh my gosh, I could go on and on and on and on and on with all of these things that are coming about in the next few years. Now, maybe they won't come about in 10 or 15 years. Maybe it'll be 30. Maybe it'll be 50. But they're going to come. And, especially the stuff about DNA. Because we know how DNA works. We don't know how to mix it very well. But we know the basic structure. We're not quite sure yet how to develop robots, for instance, that are as smart as humans and have perhaps a conscience. Okay, that's still theoretical. But DNA is not theoretical, all right? You can mix stuff. Much of our food in the United States is actually what some people nickname Frankenfood, but it's a combination of different species. The tomato you may be eating may have some DNA from an octopus, all right? So, if you took one of those silk goats, they still are goats. It's just that some of the stuff that produces milk it changes the milk consistency to more what the spider web consistency would be. Slight alteration, but if you were to grind that goat up and make it into sausage and eat it, you're getting some spider DNA. All right, it sounds freaky, but it's true. We're already doing it. So in a sense, heck, I have mentions in my sci-fi book of centaurs and what I call azogs, which are human reptilian mixes that are used for sex slaves. And you'd be able to do that if you're able to totally know which genes line up which way and how they could be compatible. So you could have a human with scales, like a reptile, instead of skin. Or you could create a horse and human mix in which the back lines up in such a way and the lung capacity lines up in such a way that it could be supported and survive. Just like in Narnia. All those animals and so forth. Sometimes you wonder, was that based on, some of the ancient writings? Because I know that, these Tolkien's and C.S. Lewis's and all these kind of guys were really into, ancient stuff. Reading about ancient history and folklore and so forth. So you never know. But I just wonder if maybe some of the stuff that we do, we see all this stuff. We see certain types of symbolism nowadays. We see stars in logos, all-seeing eyes. The eye logo is everywhere. The Eye of Providence, whatever you want to call it, is everywhere. In many, many, many different corporate logos, in film, and so forth. Is this conspiracy, or is it some sort of connection to the collective unconscious, which assigned value to these kinds of symbols thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years ago? Or is it a combination of both? Who knows? But it is interesting. It's actually interesting to study this stuff, because obviously there's something beyond, oh, that's pretty. All right? Seriously, there's something beyond that's pretty to explain why we are attracted to these kinds of things. And I haven't even talked about the bottom of Saturn, and so forth. If you look for, now they've taken pictures of what Saturn looks like at the bottom, but it's just really fascinating. I'd encourage people to read up on it. I would encourage people to read my book. Just check it out. See if I'm crazy, or maybe there's something like, that some of these people that have read it have gone, oh my gosh, this is really different. I had someone that was kind of down on religion, and he read it, and he was just like, oh my gosh, this could really explain the Old Testament, the book of Genesis actually being true, but just not the way it's interpreted by most people. So you never know. But anyway, look up archetypes. Look up these kinds of things. It's really fascinating stuff. I think and when you do it, you may wind up. It will challenge you, and it will blow your mind. It really will. Because then you're going to start seeing things everywhere, and whereas some of it may just be nice designs, some of it you're going, what influenced that? Okay, anyway. On the first part of the show, we dealt with the aspect of archetypes and how those are all around us. If we start learning about symbols and so forth, you can, if you have an interest in archetypes, and many people run across these kinds of things when they're researching conspiracy issues and things like that, look up Carl Jung. Take a look at some of the writings he did and his view of the importance of these things. Now, I just wonder, I think actually that corporations and so forth really do look into these kinds of things in order to improve their sales and perhaps create a personality around their brand. It's actually quite interesting. I always wondered why the Pentagon was designed the way it was, and then I researched it and found out that the designer was kind of into, I wouldn't even just say archetypes. I mean, maybe a little bit of, how would you say it? Maybe occultish sort of ideas. But nevertheless, you get the Pentagon, which is a symbol that goes all the way back to Pythagoras, in which it was the symbol that people wrote on their hands as a way of going in and seeing the rest of the disciples of Pythagoras. It was a religious cult. They believed that God's language was mathematics, and that you'd be able to unlock all the mysteries of the universe through the use of mathematics. I've actually heard some people talk about the Hadron Collider in Switzerland and say that ultimately you'll find the God particle. You'll be able to find how God set the universe up. And this could go back to Pythagoras. It probably goes back long before Pythagoras, because he didn't claim to come up with everything himself, but was based on ancient, very, very, very ancient writings, which of course could predate, for instance, as we were talking about earlier, it could predate the flood, so that these mathematical symbols were thought to have some sort of significance. Therefore, you had things like Washington, D.C. based along a certain sort of grid that some people will say is occultish. Of course, it goes into what we define as occult, which usually means hidden knowledge. So when you say occult, it does not necessarily mean that you are talking about such things as Satanism or something like that. Instead, you could be looking into, by strict definition, psychology comes under the occult, because you learn how to manipulate people. If you're using psychology for marketing, and my gosh, the psychology that's used now goes so far beyond anything Edward Bernays had ever dreamed of. I'm going to do a show on this in the near future, where you can be, through your social media, you can be manipulated by just stories that are fed through to you by advertisers and so forth, and that can relate also to politics. But essentially, psychology could be seen as occultish. Any discipline where you know something that can affect other people, but they're not aware of it, by and large. I guess under that definition, nowadays most people don't know that much about math, so therefore we could go back to Pythagoras. But I do think I got to say one thing. It is interesting, our entertainment differences nowadays. I mean, if you remember back maybe to grade school, some of you may have seen the old Donald Duck thing, Mathematics Land, in which they talk about Pythagoras and pentagrams and that sort of thing. You wouldn't see that nowadays in cartoons. It was very high order cognitive reasoning that was just part of entertainment. And nowadays our entertainment is just pretty much fluff. It's designed to get it's almost like in the media when we talk about clickbait, and how clickbait is something that may not even have anything to do with a real story, but or if it is designed about a real story, it's sensationalized, kind of tabloid style, to get us to click it on. And that's the way our media is becoming. I mean, if you remember that one scene in 1984 where Winston's friend is eating at the table with him, and they're talking about how someday, if they're successful, people won't even be able to have conversations anymore because they're going to rewrite the entire dictionary to where each year it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually you wind up with a situation in which communication is pretty much impossible. I know it, when I read 1984 and later saw the movie, I was thinking, well, wouldn't that be kind of difficult to achieve? Sort of seeing it nowadays. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe the next presidential election or the presidential election after that is just nothing more than a Twitter post from both candidates. They can send out their message that way. We're almost at that point. But anyway, back to Jung. I would really strongly encourage people to look it up, and you'll be surprised at how much, if you know about Jung and symbolism and so forth, you'll be able to watch a movie and, spoiler alert, it will spoil you. You'll be able to tell for most of the part, 90% of all movies you can watch a few minutes of, and you're going to know who the villain is, how it's going to wind up, what the major plot is, and so forth. It's really quite fascinating. But you don't change your formula all the time. For movies, that would make no sense. Movies are a technique to get people to watch. So therefore, if something's successful, you just rehash it, and rehash it, and rehash it, and rehash it. And it can even cross over genres too. Okay, so symbolism is something that is taken very seriously by many people, and if you don't know that, then everything's going to be subconscious. And if Jung is even partially correct about the effects of the collective unconsciousness and how archetypes and symbolism communicate to us indirectly through dreams, through feelings, through intuition, then we have to ask ourselves, can we truly be free and can we truly be independent if we don't know the power of this abstract concept? Because, I mean, it's a language in and of itself. In fact, actually, language is nothing more than abstract, because we put letters that when we were little, we associated with certain sounds according to certain animals, and then subconsciously we forget that. But it was all part of a program, to learn how to read, that, we just now, we throw everything together and we can read words. Chomsky wrote a lot about this. I had to refresh my mind a little bit when dealing with the power of words and how language can affect thought and that sort of thing. But ultimately, I think that if archetypes are a form of language, which Jung believed they were, and it was at a deeper level, then maybe people should learn more about it. And we got to get past this whole culture of ignorance. We have a culture that celebrates lack of knowledge. We have a culture that celebrates it being cool to be stupid. Okay, they don't call it stupid, but it's essentially cool to be stupid, to be uninformed. If someone asks you a question, you're like, I never thought about that, and that sort of thing. That's not cool. Okay, it's not cool in front of a large audience to admit that you don't know very much. But yet, that is what Hollywood has fed us. That's how we have then socialized with our friends who are also fed by these images and movies and so forth. And we lose really our own identities. And we merge into this kind of collective consumeristic goo, you might say. Well, let's try to break out of the goo. Try to get past it. Try to learn about some of these things. I mean, it's actually interesting. It's not dry. Learn about Freud. Learn about Jung, Adler, Skinner, these kinds of people, because they gave such incredible insights. And you know what? If you think it's boring, you got to remember some of the people out there that actually run the society, that sit back and think about ways to use the media to make you who you are, to get you to think differently, act differently, and so forth in all aspects of life. They have studied these people. They know the theory.